what would be a good thing to put together for a Bible study service on Pentecost weekend. And I thought, well, I think I know what since I've never spoken on it here before, I would. In the study of the Bible, one of the most interesting subjects, and one of the more interesting subjects, is the study of typology. Now, what is typology? It's the study of types. The study of types, it comes from the Greek word for types. In the New Unger's Bible Handbook, it says this: a type is a double representation in action, the literal being intended and planned to represent the spiritual. A type is thus the divine impress of spiritual truth upon a literal event or person or thing. And one example of typology in the Bible, and there are many, but the one I want to look at here today is the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, which was traditionally read, I believe still is in the Jewish quarters, on Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, as they would look at it. I'd like to give a little background as we begin to start and take a look at this. You can be turning to the book of Ruth, just 4 chapters, very short, but it is very meaningful in respect to the meaning of this feast we're going to be keeping and beginning, of course, at sundown here tonight. This book was traditionally read at the, as I mentioned, at the Feast of First Fruits. Now, the Jewish people consider that the Feast of First Fruits begins with the wave sheaf offering during the days of unleavened bread, and they call it the Feast of First Fruits. But what it is actually is the very beginning of the Feast of First Fruits. That is, the harvesting of the spring first fruits goes all the way for 50 days, 7 Sabbaths and 1 day. And this is day 49. And we'll look as we go at some of the scriptures and reviewing of that briefly as we go along here. The book of Ruth is one of 5 books called the Megalot. The Megalot was Megolott, festival books, the festival books. In the spring, during unleavened bread, Passover, unleavened bread, you have the Song of Solomon, Song of Solomon. At Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks, or Feast of Harvest, Feast of First Fruits, all these different names we'll look at, by the way, as we go along here. Actually, probably more so tomorrow on that. But the book of Ruth would be read at this time. Then as you get further into the summer and before you begin to reach the fall holy days, you have the book of Lamentations, the 3rd book of the festival books, read at the Feast of Ab. What was the Feast of Ab? Well, the Feast of Ab was on the 5th day of the 5th month, and it was the day that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and later in 70 AD on the same day by the Romans. And it's interesting that it happened on both of those dates. At the Feast of Tabernacles, there is a festival book that would be read every year, the book of Ecclesiastes. And you might be asking, well, what's that got to do with the meaning of the Feast of Tabernacles? Well, maybe I've done that before at the feast in a Bible study, and maybe couldn't I do that again sometime. Now, the 5th festival book is Esther, read at the Feast of Purim, and that would usually be somewhere around the 1st of December on our calendar. Of course, it was not a holy day, but it was because how God saved the Jewish people from destruction by the Persians, and used Queen Esther in carrying that out. Very interesting story. The book of Esther is a very interesting book, too. The only book where the name of God is not mentioned in the Bible and in that book. There are only 2 books in the Bible named after women, Ruth and Esther. And we'll look at the one today with Ruth. The Jewish Talmud says that Samuel wrote Esther. There is a little problem. Some disagree with that because as you get to the end, we'll see later today, as we get to the end of the book of Ruth, it is talking about the genealogy from Ruth up to King David. Well, there would have been a problem. Somebody had to have added that later if Samuel wrote the main content of it, because he was dead. Couldn't have. So somebody had to add that later on. But it does appear that it was written sometime around the period of King David, looking back. And it most likely was Samuel who at least wrote the major part of it. The reason also that it's looked upon as written in King David's time is because of chapter 4 and verse 22, the genealogy there at the end of the book. The time setting of the story is in the early days of the Judges. It's rightly placed in the Bible between the book of Judges and 1 Samuel, and it fits right there very well. We find here, and I'm going to just turn over to Matthew chapter 1, and in verse 5 of Matthew 1:5, and I'll be switching back here to Ruth. But we have genealogy, of course, leading up to Christ here in Matthew chapter 1, but in verse 5, Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. Do you remember who Rahab was? She was the ex-prostitute, if you will, there in Jericho. She had the red thing put out, the threads, was it, so they would not enter her place when they invaded the city and the walls came down. The spies, she had hid out the spies and helped them to escape back to the camp of Israel before all of that happened, and certainly they protected her. Well, then she married an Israelite named Salmon, and their child, their son, was Boaz. Boaz is going to be a prominent name in the book of Ruth, and you'll see why as we go through here. And then from there, of course, Boaz is going to marry Ruth, as you see at the end of the book. By the time we get to this, Joshua, of course, has passed from the scene. The time setting is around 1325 BC. That's a long time ago, right, for all of us, 1325 BC. Let me give you a brief summary of the story before we actually start going through it here. There's an Israelite family, because of famine in the land, they decide to migrate over to Jordan, what would be Jordan today, or then called the land of Moab. The head of the family, his name is Elimelech. His wife is Naomi, and they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And so they go to the land of Moab, and after they get there, the father dies. Elimelech dies. The two sons marry women of Moab, and soon after they've married those women, they die. And so all that's left of the family is Naomi, the wife and mother. They are also two widows. The sons had married Moabite women, one of them being Ruth. And so you have three widows after the three husbands have died. And they begin to return to Israel. But one of them, whose name was Orpah, returns to her people. Ruth, the other widow, she runs into Boaz after returning to Israel, who is a nephew of Elimelech. Now these people, I'll explain what the typology is of all of them. You're just hearing me say names here and kind of giving you a brief summary before we get into it. But in typology, they represent things that are very important to us in this feast at this time. In time, Boaz practices the law of a kinsman redeemer so that he can marry Ruth. Now, that is very interesting. I don't want to get too much into explaining that ahead of time, but when we get to it, I'll put it this way. It's proof that God is not a socialist. When you understand this law and what the purpose of the law has to do of the kinsman redeemer. Just keep that in mind, and I'll come back to that as we come to it in the story. So he practices the law of a kinsman redeemer. He marries Ruth, and she becomes a direct link in the family of David and of Jesus Christ. And of course is in the genealogies to follow. All right, let's now go to the book itself and begin to go through it here. And I don't think I don't think I have to go overtime too long, maybe 30, 40, 50 minutes. No, we'll be on time, don't worry. I just want to see if, if that did concern you or not. Well, I look at Tom there, and no, he's not too sure. No. All right, chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, that is, when the judges, as the center margin says, when the judges judged, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Elimelech was his name, and I'll read it here. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Interesting, apparently here of the tribe of Ephraim and in Bethlehem. Ephrathites, and they would return there later, that is, the 2 of the 3 widows would. Well, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. And by the way, that's what it is actually in the Hebrew. You get a lot of, in the Greek, it's R-O-U-T-H, I believe, and that it's not really a translation, it's literal when it comes to that particular name. And they dwelt there for about 10 years. And then both Mahlon and Chilion, who also died, so the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. And that is Naomi, the main mother there, survived that. One thing I should comment on verse 1 concerning Bethlehem, which means the house of bread. The bread of life would later be born in Bethlehem, Jesus Christ, right? We're looking at typology here. A couple things here about Elimelech is a type of the Lord of the Old Testament. The Lord before the captivity. His name means, my God is king, Elimelech. Naomi is a type of the Old Testament Israel. Her name means pleasant one, pleasant one. Mahlon's name means sickly, and of course he died. Chilion's name means wasting or pining. Moab, actually, here as a country, is a type of Israel being dispersed among the nations. You have 2 things here when it talks about the Redeemer, not only of the physical Israel, but as you will see also as we go along, a type of the first fruits or those of the New Testament church. So Elimelech dies in verse 3, which is a type of the Lord of the Old Testament, removing himself from Israel, removing himself. Going on down a couple more verses here. Let's go to verse 4. Now they took wives. Well, I read that. Let's go down to verse 6. Then she arose, with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Giving them bread. Obviously, having problems, not getting the rains like we had here last night, to be able to grow and bring up the wheat and barley. You have to get it to the right point, and then it has to have a period of dryness before you cut it. In verse 6 here, Naomi hears God may be found again in Israel. It's a type of the time when physical Israel will set its face to return to God. You know, it's interesting when you think about it. In our country today, you have people who do want to, in many ways, turn to God. They talk about it. You hear about it. I heard it even on Fox News, who was one of the commentators was saying in relation to what happened in Uvalde and all the children who were killed. And it's not going to be gun regulation, it's returning to God. And you have people who seem to be and are quite sincere wanting to do that. But the problem is not enough of them. And we have so much going on when you see the killings and everything in the major cities. And just out of nowhere, somebody shoot somebody on a subway train in New York City or wherever it might be, whether it's Portland, whether it's all of these cities. The percentage of increase of murder and terrible crimes against their fellow citizens is up incredible. Over 30% up in these cities. Washington, yes, Washington, but I'm thinking of Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, every one of these cities. And then, of course, on the East Coast here, and New York especially, too, is just incredible. Chicago leads them all. 47 shot last weekend. And you just, how do you explain all of this? I mean, you've got an open season of war and going on between, I don't know if it's gangs or just what. Well, it does come to my mind when I read this and I look about Naomi here and representing Israel of the Old Testament, and when he showing that physical Israel set his face to return to God. Now let's drop down here, verse 7, 8, and 9. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." She's not a cheerful lady at this point, is she? She's suffered some terrible losses. If it's a type of Israel being brought back from captivity, and as you read a couple more verses, it'll become, I think, more clear. Have you ever thought about, I've covered it in prophecy, Jeremiah 16, Jeremiah 23, and Christ, the branch, will lead the remnant back from the north country. But I haven't really stopped when I talked about that. I read this is what's going to happen when Christ returns. What state of mind will they be in when they come back? They've all lost families, members of the family. God has sealed those who are coming back from the day of the Lord, so they survived. But did everybody and their families survive? Realistically, I don't think so. You look at the people suffering in the Ukraine, losing family members, having their grandparents or whatever shot laying in the streets. That has to affect one's mind, to say the least, to see that when it's somebody very close to you. And there's a lot of emotional repairing that'll have to take place when Christ returns, when the remnant of Israel, the remnant of Judah comes back. there will be suffering. Well, look at the Holocaust, those who survived. It took them a long time. It's just like a lot of our servicemen who were involved in wars. It took them a long time to get over that, and some things they never got over, and when they came back. All right, let me move along here. Verse 9, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them. They lifted up their voices. They wept. It was very emotional. And she was telling them, no, daughters, you stay. And they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I should say that I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, in other words, I'm too old for that, as she was saying. Now, would you wait for them till, if I did have sons, till they were grown? And would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Did the hand of the Lord go out directly against her? Time and chance happens to us all. Did she do something? In other words, like whatever it is, the Lord has done this to me. Sometimes even in the church, people will say, almost like blaming God, he did this to me for some unexplainable reason. No, not really, not at all. Turn back, my daughters, verse 12, go, for I am too old to have a husband, and if I should, I read that. Verse 13, would you wait for them? Let's drop down then to verse 14. And then they lifted up their voices, and they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Ruth, return after your sister-in-law. In other words, she's talking now to Ruth. But Ruth said, and this is beautiful what we see here in verse 16 and 17, and it relates to a Christian today. I'll explain. But Ruth said, entreat me not to leave you or to turn back. In other words, don't make me have to go back, or don't tell me that I have to, from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Can you think of a place in the Gospels that would be a parallel to that? How about Luke 14? Counting of the cost, which we go through when we have baptismal counseling. That is a very important part of it. Ruth has counted the cost. I want to serve your God, Naomi. I want to serve you. I will be loyal to you. I do not want to turn back, and where you die, that's where I want to die. Isn't that what we are saying when we are counting the cost and coming to repentance and to baptism? That you are number one in my life, God and Jesus Christ. And this is very interesting when you look at this and realize who Ruth, well, I'll just tell you, as we get through the book, she represents a New Testament church. And the man she's going to meet, Boaz, represents Jesus Christ. When you look at that typology here. But it's very interesting, the attitude. Now, Ruth had known her mother-in-law for 10 years in Moab, and now they're coming back. And This is very, very interesting, verse 16 and 17, what Naomi has to say. And it's almost like what each and every one of us at one point in so many words have had to come before God in our knees and said to him and to Jesus Christ. Well, as we go on here, verse 18, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Doesn't do any good. She's made up her mind. You know, I remember I was with an elder one time, and he was leading. I was just a trainee with him at the time. And going through talking to this individual who wanted to be baptized, and he said, "Isn't there any way I can talk you out of this?" Now, he was wanting to see the reaction. How bad do you want this? Do you really, or are you just wanting to join it because the individual had grown up in the church and everything? Are you just wanting to go along because of the family? Or is there more to this? We did baptize the individual, but I remembered that. I thought it was kind of interesting that he said that at the time. And it kind of reminds me of this when I look at here. Naomi says, it doesn't do any good to talk. She's made up her mind. I can't talk her out of it. She is going to cling to me, whereas Orpah did not cling to her. You can almost think of the example in the Gospels where the woman, 12 years with an issue of blood, was it, and touched, grabbed Christ's, whose virtue has gone out. Here was a woman who knew if only I touch, and there's more to it than that, I won't let loose either. And that should be our attitude. No matter what happens in life, we are not going to give up. And it didn't matter what was going to happen or would ever happen. Ruth has made up her mind. Here is where I stand with your God, and I'm going to worship him. And she came to know and understand that's the only God there is. Okay, let's drop on down. Verse, every time I look up to talk to you, I forget where I left off. Verse 19. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened that when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" It's been 10 years, right? But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." And, well, the attitude there on that part certainly is not right. It's not good either. A lot of times people tend to want to blame God for the situation. She is bitter, as it says there, literally bitter, as to what has happened because of her loss. But I don't know if you had an opportunity to watch Thursday, the 70th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth. And the commentators were talking a little bit about her religious mind and her beliefs. And in relation to all the problems in the family, the royal family over the years. And they said she is a very religious woman, and I had seen and heard that she was, and even at the time that she was crowned the Queen of England, whatever year, 70 years ago. But one thing stood out or caught my attention, that she always looked at everything. They said she looks at that it will all work out with God. Now, she hasn't said that that I know of anyhow, made that public. That's a statement she has said to people in private, which was somehow got to the people on Fox who were covering it the other day. I thought it was very interesting. The reason I bring that up at this time is because that's what Naomi really needs to come to see. Returning to Israel, the God of Israel, it will work out. It will work out, and in time. And very interesting about, probably that's the reason why God has given this woman 70 years on the throne over there, which is the longest in history of anyone reigning that I believe that they were commenting on. Now going on, I went out full, verse 21, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? Really? Is that what he does when we have a setback? Yes, it's sad that your husband died. We know we're all going to die sooner or later, right? And I don't, it's like we're blaming God here. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. When is that? Nobody knows? I'll look over here at some of our leading men. Well, the barley harvest begins after the wave sheaf offering. And who is the wave sheaf? Who did that represent? It's Jesus Christ, right? Following the weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. It's not a Sabbath or an annual Sabbath day, but it is a special offering. There is a picking of the barley and made into a sheaf. And if you've ever been up in Amish country, you see that in the fall, how they harvest up there, and they're out there in the field, everything, all these things are sticking up because they pick it, they bind it. Well, the small one of barley in the spring would be very, very small. And it was offered up, and that represented Jesus Christ being accepted by the Father, which is why he said there in, John 20, verse 17, I think it is, "Don't touch me, I have not yet ascended." He was, of course, to be that. He is the wave sheaf, the first to be accepted. So if we see now, they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Okay, it's during the days of unleavened bread. And guess what? At the end of the book, it's going to be at the end, on Pentecost, and for 50 days, and things that this story will take place. Chapter 2, as we go on here, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. So Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter, and do that." Now, it was not just barley, but also there's a spring wheat harvest. I'll turn tomorrow to the scripture that points that the first fruits is both barley and wheat in the spring during these 50 days. But you could not begin to harvest the barley or the wheat until after the wave sheaf offering was made. And then for the next 50 days, ending at the Feast of Weeks, you come to the harvest, the ending of it. Then you have the bigger one in the summertime. And that would not begin until after the Feast of Weeks has been finished. Now, as we go on here, chapter 2, I've read about Boaz. Let's look at verse 2. So Ruth, verse 3. Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered him, "The Lord bless you." And then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this over here?" And so the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." Now, they're gleaning. A couple things should be, maybe before I go on, should comment here. The gleaning in the fields is a type of searching for the truth. When you're gleaning, you glean it out. You keep the wheat from the tares, and separating all of it, and you're searching out to make sure you get all the grain and the wheat out. Now, Boaz, I told you earlier, is a type of Jesus Christ here in this story. What about his servants? They're a type of the angels. He gives them authority to watch over this woman. And certainly, unbeknownst to us, God has put angels about us. And when he was calling us, that were helping and working with us, and we probably never realized it or knew it at all. And that's what certainly the servants here are types of. It talks about people's angels in the book of Acts. And what was it there? What chapter is it? It's chapter 12. Well, I better not, I'd have to go review it, but where it does talk where they thought, made the statement, it was his angel that they were thinking that they had seen or come in contact with. Now, going on down, verse 6, so the servant who was in the charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She has, the talk has made the town. They all respect and admire this particular woman. She said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. I want you to stay, in other words, I want to make sure that you're taken care of here in every way. Certainly God does the same for us. Verse 8, or verse 9, let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Verse 10, so she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? You know, it probably can remind you of the question that probably every one of us has asked when we were especially coming into the truth. Why me? Why me? Especially if you try to pass it on to relatives or close friends. And you got that very negative response, right? And this was part of our growing up and coming into the truth and into the church. And here Ruth is asking this, why are you, she didn't realize it, but you know, the Israelites were not supposed to have anything to do with the people of Moab or Ammon or Moab. Why? Because when they were coming out of the wilderness, they would not let them pass through their land. And yet you will find, it's interesting that in the lineage of Jesus Christ, you have a Canaanite woman, Rahab. You will have a Moabite woman, Ruth. God is grafting in. And we would see later in the book of Romans how that Paul would show, as he wrote to the Gentiles, and he said, you were grafted in. Once you were, afar off? Now you are a part of Israel, the new Israel. And, You begin to see it right here in this physical thing that's taking place. Verse 11, Boaz answered and he said to her, "It has been fully reported to me that all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and you have come to a people whom you did not know before. Will the Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge?" And then she said, "Well, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservants, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Well, obviously I'm not, first of all, they're of the lineage of Israel, and I'm not. So now Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here, come here, and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." And so she, I've never had it that way. I don't know if you have or not, but they didn't have quite the variety of food that we have today to eat. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her. She ate and was satisfied and kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her in any way for what she is doing." In other words, taking more than what she otherwise lawfully should. You see in these verses here in chapter 2, it's a type of being sanctified or set apart when she is being given this special favor. Verse 11, we see that Ruth is stepping out in faith by what she says there. Verse 12 is a type of trusting God. You know, God blesses us without our being aware of it at times. And certainly in calling us, when you look back, that many times we didn't maybe recognize God was working at the time he was. His purpose is to convert us if he is calling us. God is pleased to bless one with such an attitude, as we see that Ruth has. Ruth was not aware that Boaz, at this point in time, could redeem her at this point. It's a type of being protected by God from Satan. You know, Satan knows when God is trying to call somebody to work with them, wants to really give them some real fits in a lot of cases, some incredibly difficult trials. God does protect people so that he can bring them. Now, going on down here, let's keep going. What did I leave off at? 17. "And she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Then she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where have you gleaned today? You got an awful lot here. Where did you go to get this? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you.' And so she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, 'The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.' And then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead.'" Naomi's attitude is changing and encouraged by what she sees. So Naomi said to her, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." Ruth, verse 21, the Moabitess said, "He also said to me, 'You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that people do not meet you in any other field.' So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. She stayed with them how long? 50 days. That's when it's over. Till the end of the barley and the wheat harvest of the spring. Interesting that it's set during the 50 days, the 7 weeks and 1 day. Now, in chapter 3, then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I seek security," or as it says in the margin, "rest for you, that it may be well with you?" This rest is going to be equal to marriage. We're going to have rest with our husband, Jesus Christ, the marriage supper, the marriage to the Lamb. This is what is eventually, he is a kinsman, we have a Redeemer, don't we? And we are going to be married to our Redeemer. That's what the Bible says. And that's why you look at this and you see such a typology here of what takes place in the New Testament when Jesus Christ comes. Even down to the actual 50 days from the time of the beginning of the harvest until the end, stays there until the end of it. 50 days. Now, verse 2, now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing or sifting barley tonight in the threshing floor. Now, being the wealthy man, why he was there at that night sifting it in the threshing floor, well, it doesn't tell us. You would think he would have his servants doing it. Therefore, verse 3, wash yourself, anoint yourself, and put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be that when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Now, Naomi's a pretty wise woman here, I guess, in what she's instructing Ruth to do. And she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. Actually, isn't that what we say to Jesus Christ? I will do whatever you tell me to do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had instructed her to do. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain, and she came, softly uncovered his feet, and lay down as well. Now, he obviously was having some wine with his dinner, and there as he was cheerful and everything. Isn't it interesting? Jesus Christ had wine. They called him a wine bibber, a drunkard. Some will say, but he never drank wine. He was on, what is it? It was, I can't think of the term I want to say here. It was non-toxic, what's the word? Unfermented, there you go. Unfermented. Well, if it's unfermented, it's what? It's grape juice, right? But if you go to Luke chapter 7, verse 34, it says he drank wine, oinos in the Greek, which is fermented wine. The first miracle in John chapter, 2, verse 10 there, changing the water into wine at the wedding supper. And the head of the feast, the governor of the feast, said, well, you have saved the best wine, not knowing that a miracle had taken place. You've saved the best for the last. Usually the best is at the beginning. Of course, the Jewish wedding festival. It wasn't just like ours. I mean, it went on for days. And so you've saved the best. Instead of at the beginning, you've saved it here at the end. Yes, Jesus did, but he also exercised self-control. As the commercial says, he knew when to say when. And it was not a problem. And if people have a problem with it, well then, hey, they either should not drink or they need to say when sooner. But you find throughout the Bible, if you traveled over to Israel, in 1978, we had the opportunity to be down at Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank today. And you don't get tours by tour buses down there because you might get shot. But we were able to go down to Bethlehem, through Bethlehem, on further south to Hebron, to the tomb of the patriarchs. And that's very interesting that the cave of Machpelah is underneath that the huge block building made. It was built by Herod. I believe it was Herod the Great that built it. Both the Muslims and the Jews recognize that the patriarchs and their wives are buried under there in the cave that's underneath that building. You go into that building and you have these giant, coffins with big flags over them and everything that represent Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Now Rachel is not buried there. She was buried on the road to Bethlehem. She died giving birth to Benjamin. But Leah is buried with Jacob in the cave of Machpelah underneath that big tomb in Hebron. On the way down there, the bus and the tour driver had the driver stop the bus. And he pointed over here. Here's this big gully, steep side, and you have these worn terraces. And they're smooth. They're not sharp terraces. Nothing's there anymore. He said those terraces were put there during the time of King David. And they raised their grapes to make wine. You see it all around Bethlehem as well. Bethlehem, as I remember it, was kind of up on a ridge or something, because we looked down and I could see all these terraced areas where the grapes were raised. And some still are still there, but many of them are not. It's so old. But that was what they did. They raised a lot of grapes and to make wine. So when Boaz in Bethlehem is eating and drinking and is cheered at the end, that's why he was cheered. You look at Judges 9, verse 13, is it? Or 13, verse 9. I should look it up. Wine cheers both God and man. Isn't that interesting? Judges 9:13 or 13, I think it's 9:13. You'll see it. And but again, it has to be with proper discretion. But God showed man how to, in the very beginning, how to use the grapes and to make the wine. Okay, coming back here, let's go to verse, I'm almost done. Well, I'm going to pick up in verse 10. Then he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." Now, it is true, and by the way, that's the way Jesus Christ looks at his church, as a virtuous woman. Paul referred to her in 2 Corinthians, 11, verse 2 there, as a chaste virgin. Verse 12, now it is that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning. Notice how they really respect the law of God, and there is nothing going on here between them, if you know what I mean. And Boaz, who is representing in this typology Jesus Christ, is he likewise, he calls her a virtuous woman. It'd be the same for him as a man. Then as you go to verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one could recognize another. And then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Interesting thing about that, coming to his feet. We have peace or rest in Jesus Christ when we lie at his feet. Typology, so to speak. Going on down here, verse 13. She knew where salvation came from, though she felt very undeserving as a woman here, and talking to Boaz. Verse 15, also he said, bring the shawl, and that is on you, and hold it. The cloak is what it was. And when that is on you, and hold it, and when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her, and then she went into the city. Verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, is that you, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, these 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to me, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And then she said, verse 18, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. And as you get into chapter 4 is where the conclusion of it will take place. Let's read that and we'll finish here. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. There was one who, in other words, who was one level above Boaz in being able to redeem as a kinsman Ruth, and in this story. So Boaz said, come aside, friends, sit down here. So he came aside and they sat down, and then Boaz, he takes 10 men of the elders of the city, and they said, we'll sit down here so that we need to have a discussion. Okay? Then he said, verse 3, to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. She has sold the land. Now what's interesting here? That can be redeemed back. God always wants families to maintain the inheritance of the land. I told you at the beginning, when we start reading a few more verses here, God is not a socialist. How do I know that? Because under socialism, the government owns the land. You farm it or do whatever, and you don't own it. The wealth is in the land. You can take that land, and some will develop greater wealth out of it than others. There are other factors that have to depend on that too, such as keeping the commandments of God, being generous, serving, and so on. God blesses some, maybe more than others. You know, like the parable of the, was it pounds? He gave, what was it? 5, 2, and 1, I think it was, wasn't it? The first guys doubled theirs. The last one buried his. Right? So what, then in the parable, what happened to the one who's the pound that he didn't do anything with? Take it from him and give it to the one who has 10, who has doubled 5 to make 10. Well, wait a minute. He's got 10. He's got more than everybody. Yes, but he makes it grow and produces. Give it to him. That is anti-socialism. And that, and especially when you come to see how that God, when the land was proportioned out by the tribes and the families within the tribes and all of it, it was to stay there, not to be lost, and handed down to the families. That land is yours and your descendants as long as my nation is here. And that's why there's a redeemer, because in some cases when they had become totally broke in debt, they would sell it to get out. But guess what? If there is a next of kin, he can buy it and redeem it. That's what Boaz is doing here. But there's a little catch in this one. It's not just the land. It's also the widow, Ruth. Because you see, when she was married to Killian, they never had children. And so the Redeemer, according to the laws of redemption, I'm getting along here too long, but anyhow in Leviticus 25 as well as in Deuteronomy 25, that the brother was supposed to, maybe I will take the time here in a moment here, in redeeming, is to be able to take the widow of his deceased brother, marry her to produce children that would be the descendant of his deceased brother, not him. Do you remember a couple of years ago when President George Bush went to Baghdad during the war and was in a news conference there in Baghdad, and some Arab reporter got up, took his sandal off and threw it at him? That is something that you're going to read about it here in the Bible, because that is a tradition that goes all the way back. Of course, that was out of disrespect to take the sandal off and throw it at him. I remember seeing that. I guess you did too on the news. Let's go along here, and I'll try to get to that here as quickly. It's interesting to see some of these things, and they still exist in the Middle East to this day. Now, chapter 4, verse 2 I've read. Got 10 witnesses, interesting, the number. Then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. Verse 4, and I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. And if you will redeem it, then redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And so he said, well, I will redeem it. And he didn't know that there was a catch to it. Oh, sure, I'll redeem the land. Verse 5, and Boaz said, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, well, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem it by right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. It's very interesting how these laws have worked. Let me just stop here before I go to verse 7. Let's look at Leviticus 25, quickly. Leviticus 25, and in verse 25 through 28. If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother has sold. Or if the man has no one to redeem it, but he himself becomes able to redeem it. Later on, he gets out of debt, and now I've got enough wealth accumulated, I can buy it back and redeem it back. And then let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, that he may return to his possession. But if he is not able to have it restored to himself, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee, which is what, every 50 years, right? And in the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his possession. God he wanted the families to retain the land and not to lose it forever. And the wealth is in the land, and what you do with it, and what's under the land as well. Let's go to Deuteronomy 25 quickly. Deuteronomy 25. And starting in verse 5. Here it has to do with if your brother dies and does not have a child and is left a widow, which Ruth is in this case. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel, that they will be passed on. But if a man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel, and he will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, but if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. And you'll find interesting about the sandal being removed, and of course, as you saw there a couple of years back, that thrown at President Bush in Baghdad, it's something that carries over into more than one culture there in the Middle East. It was very important. God wanted it to always remain in the family, not to be lost. And let me finish up here in the book of Ruth, going back here, verse 7. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. We have a deal. Therefore, the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day. Very interesting. And all the people who were at the gate, the elder said, We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. Well, this book certainly has made him famous. Verse 12, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. By the way, do you know that story? Genesis 38. Perez was the second born of the twin, the scarlet thread, remember? The midwife said, this one put the arm out or whatever it was first, or foot, tied that thread to it. So when he was born later, Perez and Zerah were the twins that were born to Judah. And who? Tamar. Tamar was what? She was a Canaanite. And she disguised herself to be a woman along the road. And when Judah, making a trip, saw her, was enticed by her, and the story is quite interesting, because from those two twins, Christ came through the line of Perez. And we've always wondered, and I think we have understood it, the line of Zerah did not stay there in the Middle East. And you find much of that when Jeremiah was taking the daughters to Ireland and married a king at Tara. Their capital at that time was of the line of Zerah. And it was being transferred from the Middle East. Anyhow, maybe talk about that later in next month. When we get around July the 4th is when a lot of times we'll talk about some of these things, having the United States and Britain in prophecy. Coming back, let me finish up here. So verse 12, I want to get to there. And may your house, well, I read verse 12. Now, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception. She bore a son. The woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, there is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begotten Hezron, and from the time of those twins, Perez and Zerah. But the line of Perez is the one that is listed here. Why? Because it's where David comes and Jesus Christ will come. He did not come through the line of Zerah. In verse 22, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. And then you can go to Matthew chapter 1 and follow the rest of the genealogy down to the coming of Christ. There's a very interesting story when you look at it here and realize the typology. Ruth, the virtuous woman, representing really the New Testament church, and becomes the bride of the Redeemer, Boaz. We are to become the bride of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. This is a story that pictures the redemption and the marriage of Jesus Christ to his church. At the end of the harvest of the first fruits, at the end of the 50 days. They give us the dates in there of when this began, and she stayed gleaning in the fields until the end of the harvest, which would be the 50 days. We should be encouraged by a story such as this. As we read it, we see how that just as Boaz representing Christ, typology, looked out for, watched over, took care of the one that would become his wife. So likewise does our husband, Jesus Christ. He is the head of the church. He is our head individually and collectively. And he looks over us and he watches us in all things. It shows Christ's love, and this story does, shows his love for all of us who represent his bride.